Great. Well, thanks a lot. And I know from looking out, I see a lot of faces that are familiar from this morning. Just out of curiosity, how many people were not in one of those two classes? Okay, so good, awesome. I can repeat myself. So it's great to be here and to be able to talk about this book. It would be better if I were able to give a more happy and hopeful reading of what's going on in the Middle East, but I'm not going to. As a matter of principle, I'm going to try and end on a note of some hope, because I think that's important to not give in to pessimism. But for those of you who've had the chance to read the new Arab Wars, or for those of you who follow the news on any kind of regular basis, you know that the Middle East right now it's a really terrible place. I mean, it is in an absolutely disastrous set of conditions. And you can just look around, everything from some of the most horrible civil wars and failed states that we have anywhere in the world, in Syria, Libya, Yemen. You have active hot wars in Libya and Yemen and Syria and Iraq. You've got really crushed and failed democratic transitions in places like Egypt. You have this resurgent authoritarianism, growing economic problems around the entire Middle East, with the price of oil collapsing, foreign investment drying up, and tourism going away. Basically, you have a basket of really, really terrible situations across the Middle East right now, which will come as no surprise to any of you. And what makes this so crushing and so difficult for many of us is that this comes on the heels of 2011, which is a period when I think it's fair to say that many of us who've been studying the Middle East for a long time actually felt hope for the region for the first time in a very long time. So the idea of the Middle East being a fairly dismal place politically is not new, but 2011 seemed to open up the possibility for peaceful change in a positive direction, which is something which is something that got a lot of our hopes up and got us all excited about these possibilities. And the failure of those uprisings, and I think it's fair to say that the uprisings did fail if the goal was to bring about any kind of peaceful transition to institutionalized democracy, with the exception of Tunisia. And I do love Tunisia, but it's a fairly marginal country in terms of the overall Middle East. Generally speaking, the hopes for the Arab Spring have almost completely failed, from Egypt to Syria to Libya, across the Gulf, pretty much everywhere. And so the hope that I'm going to leave you with at the end is that the extent to which you see the failure of the Arab uprisings, or the failure of the Arab Spring, as a failure very much depends on your aperture. It depends on the time horizons that you bring to your understanding of the Middle East. And so if you understand the Arab uprisings as something which began in January 2011 and failed and ended sometime around 2013, then yes, absolutely a failure, no argument, and we're all on the same page. That's not how I tend to see it, though. I tend to see what happened in 2011 as a really important inflection point in a process that had been going on for at least 15, 20 years, and which is going to continue to go on for another 15 to 20 years. It's a generational structural transformation of the Middle East. And yes, it's painful, it's difficult, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we are very much in the middle of a process, not at the end of a process. And that process is very much about the weakening of states, which have dominated the Middle East for roughly, I would say you have real state dominance going back to about 1970 or so, where the states occupied or seized really commanding power over societies, economies, and culture, and have been progressively weakening in the face of technological change, governance failure, globalization, and a rising popular rejection of their claims to dominance over politics, society, and the economy. This has been going on for at least a decade, and the Arab Spring, I think, was a part of that. Now, the initial uprising of 2011 failed, but none of the underlying drivers of those protests have gone away. And in fact, in almost every case, they have gotten more intense and more severe, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're social, whether they're generational. all of the underlying drivers of the uprisings are now worse than they were, or more intense than they were in 2010 and 2011, when we were all taken surprise by the Arab uprisings. So that's the hope that I'm going to leave you with at the end, is that we are very much in the middle of a process, and another round is almost certainly coming. Now, unfortunately, what that looks like is probably a lot worse than what we've already seen, and so it's not going to be all that hopeful. What I want to do for like 20 minutes or so that I'm going to talk is I want to walk through in a fairly schematic and quick way. What I mean is I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in any individual country. I want to walk through this question of what went wrong, how did we go from the hope of the Arab Spring to where we are today. I'm going to focus in on a few key things that I think we generally don't think about as much as we should, and then take the last 5 minutes or so and talk about the future, where I think we might be going, both for American policy, but also for the region as a whole. And that's roughly what I want to do. So to start, how did we get there? I just gave you this generational, long-term way of thinking about what's going on in the region. Let me dig into that just a little bit. So basically, what I saw studying the Middle East over the course of the 2000s, and I was writing about this at the time, so you can actually go back and check, it's not like I'm making this up later, is that what you saw over the course of the 2000s was this really interesting rising wave of protest and dissatisfaction and the expression of political dissent across much of the Middle East. Now, you saw this happening in more or less overt and direct forms. So in Egypt, for example, you actually saw rising protests in the streets. You saw labor strikes, you saw protests by intellectuals, you saw the so-called kafaya movement. It means enough. And these are like a group of like university professors, journalists, leftist activists, who are out there in the streets demanding that the president's son not succeed him as president. Things like this were happening. In other places, you saw it in Bahrain, you saw it in Morocco, you saw it in Jordan, you saw it in in Kuwait. You saw all of these episodes of protests that were emerging. But for the most part, people tended to downplay and ignore these. And not ignore them necessarily, but to downplay their significance, because there was a really deeply embedded belief that the Arab states were so strong that the protest movements and the dissent wouldn't lead to anything. In other words, that the regimes were so powerful and so overwhelmingly secure that all of this dissent was just kind of happening in the margins. And so you would pay attention to it, and people would write op-eds warning that Egypt was facing a revolutionary situation, or writing about the Orange Movement in Kuwait, or writing about this, that, or the other. But there's a general sense that it didn't amount to something which could actually challenge the structures of power in the Middle East. And I want to emphasize something really, really important here. This is often presented as a failure of either US intelligence or of Western academics. And what I want to emphasize is that the people in the region felt the same way. In other words, the activists who were out there in Egypt or Tunisia or in Yemen, they were protesting, but they also didn't really believe that success was possible. They didn't really believe that they were going to bring down governments. They were trying to widen the zone for political participation. They were trying to express dissent and widen the scope of freedoms. They were trying to mount political challenges, but almost universally, they didn't believe that they were going to be overthrowing governments or overthrowing regimes. That was beyond the realm of the imagination. They were active, they were important, they were transforming politics from below. They didn't need to overthrow governments to do that. This was kind of a real shift in the way politics worked. Okay, then when the Arab Spring breaks out, it breaks out in Tunisia, and it takes everybody by surprise, right? Because Tunisia was one of the more repressive and tightly controlled states in the region, but it also had a long history of these outbreaks of protest out in the periphery, the poor, neglected areas inside the country. Every couple of years, they would rise up, they would protest, they would riot, the police would come in and crush it. So when the protests broke out in Tunisia, most people were like, okay, well, we've seen this before, and it'll end like it always ends. The surprise was, to compress a story I'm going to compress all of these stories. I'm happy to talk about them in Q&A, but I'm going to tell all these stories very quickly. The basic outcome in Tunisia was that everybody was taken by surprise when they actually succeeded, when the president got on a plane, flew to Saudi Arabia, and gave up. Nobody expected that to happen. When he did, that opened up the floodgates, because for the first time in the modern history of the Middle East, people came to believe that they could actually drive out a head of state. They could change a regime through popular nonviolent protest. That had never happened before. Nobody ever believed it before. And when it happened, people suddenly began to hope. And as I said in class this morning, hope is a very powerful and dangerous thing. It leads people to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't take. It leads people to feel this emotional imperative to act, which might overwhelm their rationality. And that's, I think, what happened in this early feverish moment of the Arab Spring. Now, we've all been, following the news. We've seen the failures, and I think people have to a large extent, I think people have forgotten exactly how revolutionary it was in the Middle East in January 2011. When the Egyptian Revolution broke out in January 25th, 2011, it brought millions of people into the streets. And those millions of people were not just in Egypt. They were in almost every Arab country. And they were very self-consciously part of a singular, unified movement demanding change. I mean, this moment was really extraordinary. You had people from Yemen to Tunisia to Morocco, all across the Gulf, all across the Levant, and they were all out there in the streets at the same time, chanting the same slogans, holding up the same posters, copying each other's political strategies, and keeping a close eye on what was happening. So when Mubarak goes down, when he is removed from office in February 11th, in February 2011, this then inspires everybody else around the region to take even more risks. And it's this contagion effect that then spreads this protest movement across the entire Middle East. Now, this is the highest moment. I would say February, early March of 2011 is the highest tide of the Arab uprising. And it's at this point that this new book really kicks in. And it tries to explain the reaction to that moment. And it walks through several stages by which the existing regimes, the existing status quo, the regional order, responded to that threat. And you've got to understand that this was understood in the Middle East by the rulers of the Middle East very much as a threat. So in Washington, and I think in much of the world, the Arab uprisings were seen as an opportunity. This was seen as an opportunity, what I described a few minutes ago, right? The first opportunity in history for peaceful democratic change in the Middle East. The rulers of the Middle East really only care about one thing, and that's staying in power. Staying in power is the reason for their existence. It's all they really care about. And the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, were a threat to their staying in power. This was their worst nightmare. When the United States began talking about this as the hope for democratic change and speaking the language of democracy, which Americans love to hear, which I also love to hear, this was seen by many of the rulers of the Middle East as abandonment, that they believed that as allies of the United States should be protecting them against threats. And those threats are not just Iran, not just Al-Qaeda, those threats are also democracy, because democracy might also remove them from power. And so they were determined, as soon as possible, to strike back and prevent the possibility of peaceful change. And much of the story of what went wrong with the Arab Spring was that the Arab Spring was going after the Arab regimes, knocked out a few of them. The others were not knocked off. They responded and they won. They crushed these popular protest movements because they wanted to stay in power. And you know the old line, if you're going to shoot at the king, you best not miss. And that's basically what happened in the Middle East, is that the protest mobilization and movement was not strong enough to get to the real centers of power in the region, and they fought back, and for the most part, they won. How did they do it? The first step was they protected themselves. Now, this was easy in some places, hard in other places. So in the really, really rich countries of the Middle East, like Qatar and the UAE, they have so much money and they have such a pervasive security state that they face no real challenges. And that was great for them. That was actually power. To not face domestic protest, that's a form of power in the Middle East after 2011. Others had to take more active measures. Saudi Arabia faced real fears about the possibility of an uprising, and they responded very proactively. They arrested dissidents who might potentially cause trouble, and they also initiated a massive public spending campaign. $120 billion in public spending buys off a lot of potential opposition. Remember, price of oil is very high at this point. Their coffers are overflowing with money. This is a good use of money if you want to stay in power. Gaddafi died with billions of dollars in the bank unspent. That's a lesson that other Middle East leaders were not going to replicate. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE immediately protect themselves. Then they help their friends. So there are other states in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arabian Peninsula, that aren't so wealthy. Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, they're rich, but not quite that rich. And so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar helped them out. They gave them money, they gave them political support, and in one case, Bahrain, they actually sent in an active military intervention to help crush the largest per capita uprising in the entire Middle East. You've probably all heard this argument that the Arab monarchies are more legitimate than the presidents, and therefore there were no uprisings in the monarchies. It's totally false. The Kuwait and Oman had the largest popular mobilizations in their modern history, and Bahrain had the largest per capita mobilization of any Arab country, including Egypt and Tunisia. There were plenty of protests in Arab monarchies. It's just that those monarchies had the money and resources and external support to win. And in the case of Bahrain, that took the form of some of the most vicious and brutal sectarian repression anywhere in the Middle East. For those of you who are planning future career opportunities at our naval base in Bahrain, get ready for what is going to be an extremely unpleasant operating environment if that base still exists by the time you guys are working at them, because Bahrain basically purchased short-term survival at the cost of alienating the vast majority of their population, which is the Shia majority of the country. So that's the first wave. The defensive perimeter extends to other friends outside the Gulf. Jordan and Morocco, again, large-scale financial and political assistance to make sure the Jordanian, the quite poor Jordanian and Moroccan monarchies don't fall, and that worked as well. It kept them afloat. They carried out some political reforms, played their usual game of dividing the opposition. It worked, and they survived. That was phase two. Phase one was self-defense. Phase two was the defensive perimeter. Okay, phase three was a little bit different. In countries where the leaders fell too fast, Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen, it turned into a game of political warfare in which the game was to try and shape the political outcome of those countries. And what I mean by that is that, okay, the game is now democracy. The game is now political transition. You want to make sure that your guys win that democracy. You can't get rid of Egyptian or Tunisian democracy at this point in time, but what you can do is try and make sure that your people win. To compress this very, very, very much, in both Egypt and Tunisia, you have the same basic trajectory. You'll often hear the opposite, but in fact, it's the same basic trajectory. In both cases, Islamist coalitions win the original elections with support from Qatar and Turkey. This moves them from the pro-Saudi camp into the pro-Qatari camp. In Egypt, you have a military coup which throws the Islamists out and reinstalls Saudi and Emirati allies from the military and the old elite back in power by force. In Tunisia, the Islamists voluntarily step down from power and allow a Saudi and Emirati-backed coalition to take power in the form of what's called the Nida Tunis coalition. The process is totally different. I like Tunisia's much better than Egypt's. But the outcome in terms of regional politics is the same, where they are restored to a Saudi-led regional order, and basically their democracy, such as it is tamed and prevented from carrying out any serious regional transformation. Yemen looks a little bit different. I don't have time to get into all the intricacies of Yemen, but again, you have a GCC-led transition in Yemen, which then falls apart in 2015. That was phase four. Phase five, though, was the opportunities. Everything that I was talking about so far was threats. Threats where one of the allies of the regional order was faced with a domestic threat and needed to be helped, or else needed to be, have those games played. The opportunities came when uprisings came against enemies of the existing regional order, and that's Syria and Libya. In those cases, popular uprisings, and I have to be really clear here, these were genuine popular uprisings. They were not manufactured foreign conspiracies like you'll often hear. They looked just like the uprisings every place else, where you have frustrated citizens taking to the streets, using new media to popularize their cause. It's the same set of grievances and all of that. But in this case, in Libya and Syria, those leaders were enemies of the existing order, and therefore the uprisings represented an opportunity rather than a threat. In Libya, all of the states of the GCC, who usually don't agree on anything, they all agreed that they all hated Muammar Gaddafi. And they all united very quickly around supporting the uprising against him, and then very quickly into arming the insurgency against him. Arab League very quickly issues an endorsement of the rebel cause. You get a UN Security Council resolution, you get a NATO-led military intervention, and you get 6 months later Gaddafi dying in a ditch, and then leading to the stuff that I'll talk about in a second. In Syria, it's the same basic template. Bashar al-Assad had no friends in the Gulf. He had no friends in the Middle East. His friends were in Tehran and in the so-called resistance bloc. And when the uprising began, this became a target of opportunity, a chance for the Gulf states and Turkey to break away. This is really important. People often forget this, that Assad was the key Arab ally of Iran and of Russia, and that his fall would have represented a major change in the regional balance of power in favor of the conservative bloc. And so when the uprising began, and it was a peaceful uprising, it was met with extreme brutality. There's no question about where the initial bloodshed began or who bears the lion's share of the responsibility for the atrocities which followed. This was a civic uprising which was met with brutal military force. And it was gradated over time. It started off relatively low scale and quiet, but then rapidly expanded as the challenge didn't go away. Bashar al-Assad clearly wanted to avoid any kind of Libya-type situation where you get a UN Security Council resolution, external military intervention. He wanted to kill a lot of people and destroy the uprising, but not do it so bluntly and overtly that it would lead to an international military intervention. And this succeeded. In that sense. He managed to gradate his violence in such a way that it was never quite enough to trigger an international military intervention. For about a year, the Syrian uprising had that form. The civic uprising, which was facing growing brutality from the regime. The casualty numbers are growing rapidly. You're seeing the destruction of cities. You're seeing all kinds of atrocities taking place. Right around January, February 2012, the situation changes in a fundamental way. Basically, diplomacy ends with the failure of UN Security Council resolution. The civic uprising gives way to an armed insurgency. Money and guns begin pouring in to the various insurgent groups coming from the Gulf, coming from Turkey, and then increasingly coming from the United States and Europe through Jordan and through Turkey. And the civic uprising turns into an armed insurgency. At that point, and this is one of the more controversial arguments in my book, I don't think very much of strategic consequence has happened in Syria since that decisive moment when you have a shift from a civic uprising to an armed insurgency. Because from my reading of it, as in this type of civil war, as soon as it turns into an externally fueled civil war, it becomes basically impossible to resolve. Because even if the United States had intervened more forcefully earlier on, all this would have done would have been to invite an earlier and more forceful Russian intervention in response. It's an escalatory ladder in which it could happen quickly, it could happen slowly, But basically, the literature, the academic literature on civil wars is pretty clear on this, that these types of civil wars are the worst in terms of actually being able to either win them or to resolve them through diplomacy. And so the decision to turn this into an insurgency is one that I argued against a lot at the time. A lot of Syrian opposition figures argued against it at the time. But in a sense, it was overtaken by events. The scale of brutality and the availability of external support was too great to avoid. And you talk to Syrian opposition people now, and you get the same basic response from almost everybody you talk to who was involved with the peaceful opposition at the time. We had no choice. It was forced upon us. Our people were being slaughtered. Nobody was defending us. What were we supposed to do? And that's a pretty powerful argument, and it's one that you can understand while also understanding the consequences of that decision to turn it into an insurgency. Since that time, you've had basically a strategic stalemate. Sometimes the Assad's forces are advancing, sometimes the opposition is advancing. Whenever one starts to advance, the other side gets support from the outside, pushes it back, and strategically, it's been pretty much the same stalemate for the last 4 years. The cost of that has been, by most counts, about 500,000 dead, more than 12 million people displaced from their homes, and that which is roughly half, or I think it recently crossed over to more than half of the population of Syria, displaced from their homes or refugees, and really no end in sight. We just saw enormous effort going into the negotiation, a U.S.-Russia negotiation over a ceasefire agreement, which has basically already ended, it seems. And nobody has any plan B. Nobody has any idea what to do next. And I don't think anything's going to do anything next. I think the civil war is going to continue probably for the next 5 to 10 years. Some point along the way, Assad will die. He'll be overthrown. And it's also not going to end the civil war. I think it's going to continue even after Bashar is removed from power, which is deeply depressing and deeply destabilizing for the entire region. But it's the most likely outcome of where we are right now. Out of Syria's disaster, you get the destabilization of Iraq and the reignition of the Sunni insurgency of Iraq, which in turn gives way to ISIS, the Islamic State, which is basically an outgrowth of the old Sunni insurgency in Iraq, which then moves into Syria, establishes itself, and then as the Syrian war escalates, they are able then to move back into Iraq with greater force, and that's essentially what we're at war with now in Syria and Iraq, is the legacy of the Sunni insurgency against the American occupation of Iraq, galvanized and given new shape and form by the Syrian civil war, and then establishing itself in that vast territory of western Iraq and all the way through eastern and northern Syria. And that's, again, not a very happy part of the story. One happy part of the story, I suppose, is that I'm fairly confident that ISIS as a state-like entity in Syria and Iraq will probably be gone sooner rather than later. I think that by making themselves into a state, they made themselves into the sort of thing that the United States military is very, very good at destroying. I mean, we're really good at destroying states. I mean, that's easy. You can bomb things, you can surround them, you can cut off the flows of revenues and people and arms, you can carry out a steady campaign of targeted killings, which remove the leadership, and over time, combination of economic crisis, military failure, and degradation of the leadership, and it's going to collapse. That probably is not going to lead, that certainly is not going to lead to the end of the ideology or of the decentralized, deterritorialized jihadist networks, which take advantage of every available failed state and ungoverned space in the Middle East. But it will not be a small thing to see the Islamic State project fail. So that's at least one, positive hope that we can look at. Okay. This is a general narrative. You'll notice that I put an awful lot of blame on the Arab regimes for the failure of the Arab Spring. And this is not necessarily the most popular way of analyzing it. I would say that there's actually 2, possibly 3 strands of argument about the failure of the Arab Spring, which are far more popular than mine, all of which I think are wrong. At least insufficient. The first is that it's the failure of the protesters themselves, that they failed to unite, they failed to form political parties, they failed to translate revolutionary mobilization into kind of a transitional success. And I think that that's all true. They failed in all of those ways, but I think that's a product of the backlash by regimes, not the cause of it. I think that they were the weakest of all the parties, and generally speaking, if you're looking for who to blame, you're usually better off pointing to the strongest rather than to the weakest. The second is that it's the fault of the Islamists, that jihadist movements kind of crept in, hijacked the Arab uprisings and turned them away from democracy. Again, there's some truth to that, especially in places like Libya and Syria, but there's also a lot of falsehood to it. I think that Egypt, and I can talk about this a lot more if you want, but I think that the history of what happened in Egypt has been told very badly in terms of what the Muslim Brotherhood was doing in Egypt and who's responsible for the failure there. And finally, there's a third, and that's that it's mostly Obama's fault, or it's mostly Hillary Clinton's fault, or it's mostly America's fault. And there's a reason that I spent very little time talking about the United States, because I think American policy was fairly marginal in terms of its impact in most of these outcomes. These were battles that were being fought at the local level by people who felt that their very existence was at stake. And America's ability to influence those people was relatively minimal. Like, for example, look at the military coup in Egypt, where the United States is often, Obama is often lambasted for not doing more either to support the coup or to oppose the coup. The reality is that this was something which was happening inside of Egypt, driven by an intense existential battle in which anything the United States tried to do against the coup was being explicitly and overtly countered by the Gulf states. If we cut off $1 billion in aid, they were offering $10 billion of aid to replace and what we were taking away from them. Really reduced our leverage there. Generally speaking, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Libya, any place in the Middle East, it's not that America is irrelevant. Of course, as the regional hegemon and the most powerful state in the region, what we do matters, but not as much as people think it does. Nobody in Egypt was sitting around waiting for President Obama to tell them what to do. Nobody was sitting around waiting for American policy, unless that policy was going to be on their side. They were happy to take support, but I think that we tend to overestimate how important the United States is to outcomes in the Middle East. I think that you should look at the most powerful actors in the field of play and how their policies shaped the outcomes. And I think that points to the Arab regimes as the most powerful actors and the ones who had the most impact on the outcomes. That said, they're not as powerful as we think they are, and they're not as powerful as they were. Back when I started the talk, I pointed out that in every instance, the drivers of instability are more intense today than they were in 2010 when the uprisings began. The economies are worse, the regimes are less legitimate, the opposition is angrier, the social problems are worse, and you can go across the board here. Whether it's Egypt, where we're getting to a point where they might literally not be able to feed their own people because nobody will sell them wheat because they don't believe that they'll be paid because of the fiscal crisis that Egypt is facing. You can go to the Gulf, where the collapse of the price of oil has fundamentally undermined the political economy of the region. You can look at Syria, where you have the destabilizing effects spreading everywhere. The basic point here is that a lot of us would like to believe that the Arab regimes won the Arab Spring and now they're back in control. I think the first part is true, the second part is false. They're not back in control, and they're likely to be facing another renewed round of instability in the short, not in the long term. And so I tend to be quite bearish on the future of many of these regimes or on the likelihood of stability in the Middle East. And again, I want to emphasize that this diagnosis is largely independent of what American policy is. So most people want to know, Clinton, Trump, what are they going to do? How are they going to shape American policy? They'll try, and I could, if you want, I could speculate about what I think their policies will be, but ultimately it's not going to matter all that much because the United States is not driving these outcomes. I think we will be spectators. We will be frantically trying to protect our interests, and we'll be trying to, rhetorically take credit for good things and distance ourselves from bad things. But ultimately, it's not about the United States. It's about this changing balance of power between state and society on the ground, the complete failure of governance inside the region, and the fact that those problems continue unresolved. So on that extremely hopeful note, let me stop. And so I want to be sure to take questions. I know we have very limited time here, so you can ask me. I know I ran through everything very quickly, so I'm happy to unpack specific cases or anything else.
So I have two questions. First one, we know that the Wahhabis had a great impact in the formation of the current Saudi state. And my question is, how big of an impact do they have today on the Saudis? And because of that, what is the Saudi role in supporting ISIS? Is there any kinetic one? My second question is...
Okay, that's one. Okay.
In the case of Assad, he's been in power for the last 5 years while the revolution's going on, the civil war's going on. Why is it that he's lasted so long? Gaddafi took a year, Mubarak took 2 weeks. He does have external support, but is it just external support, or is it maybe because he's more popular than what the media tells us?
Okay, let me take those in reverse order, because they're both excellent questions. On the Assad question, I think that in 2011, I think that people engaged in a lot of wishful thinking about how about how likely it was that Assad was going to fall. And I think that wishful thinking was shaped by a couple of things. One, it was shaped by the reality of what we just saw and what you just said in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen. And so there was an idea that Assad had to be next. And I think that led people to underestimate the sources of Assad's strength, which were very real, much more so than Gaddafi. Remember, Gaddafi, he led an almost completely uninstitutionalized state, which was intentionally deinstitutionalized as a form of rule, and a fiercely repressive internal security apparatus basically acting as the glue to hold things together. That's not what Syria ever looked like. I mean, certainly it was repressive and all those other things, but this was a strong state, heavily institutionalized. And in a state like that, unlike Libya in many ways, there were a lot of people who benefited from the Assad regime. There were also a lot of people who suffered from it, but there were people who benefited from it and who had very real fears about change. There were people who got rich, there were people who were insiders to the regime, and then there were a lot of minorities who were terrified at the prospect of massacres, and all of this carefully fed by Syrian state television, of course, to inflame those fears. But I would say that at the peak Assad's about to fall talk of summer to August, kind of in 2011, and then again in the summer of 2012. I mean, I was saying at the time that I thought it was extremely unlikely, and that I thought that upwards of 50% of the population was still on Assad's side, and that the turn to militarization actually probably drove more people to Assad's side because they were afraid of, they could support peaceful protesters, and they could not support a militarized uprising. I think that there was a lot of wishful thinking that went in there, and there was also, I think the media did a very poor job in 2011 because they sympathized with the uprisings, as most people did, considering what was happening to them, but they tended to report a very one-sided view of events, and they tended to not report on what was happening outside of the opposition areas, the fears of the residual Bashar supporters. And I think that there's a real residual support for the Assad regime, which people have consistently failed to understand. And then the external parts of support also do matter, but I think everyone understands that part of it. Everyone understands the Russia and Iran part and the Hezbollah part. People don't necessarily understand the domestic component. The opposition did not do a good job of reaching out and reassuring members of Bashar's coalition. And as the revolution militarized, all of these videos of the guys with the long beards killing people played right into the propaganda the regime was putting out there. So it was, in a sense, as the uprising, the insurgency became stronger militarily, its strength actually probably reinforced Bashar's coalition. It polarized things in such a way that people who didn't support Bashar as strongly before were kind of pushed back into his coalition. On the Saudi question, there's no question that the Saudi version of Islam has played an enormously important role in shaping the jihadist movements around the region over decades. I mean, this is the pillar, one of the converging streams, along with the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the radical offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood of political Islam. They come together in Al-Qaeda and the various Salafi jihadist movements around the region. This is all well documented, well understood. I don't think that there is material support from Saudi Arabia as a government to ISIS. I think that gets the question. That's not. I know a lot of people talk about it. I think it's the wrong way to frame the question. I think that Saudi Arabia is actually terrified of ISIS because it's popular inside of Saudi Arabia in many ways, and they view it as an internal threat. I think that they are also not a huge fan of al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda offshoot, for the same reason. People forget that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula came very close to assassinating the current crown prince, and he remembers that. And bin Laden, his own propaganda began with and focused upon the Saudi monarchy as his primary target. So Al-Qaeda, and that includes al-Nusra and ISIS, are not Saudi proxies. The Qataris, as far as I can tell, are far more agnostic about al-Nusra, at least, in terms of their willingness to see them play the game. But there's a huge range of what I would consider to be Salafi jihadist groups that are not Al-Qaeda or ISIS that have received huge amounts of support from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf, from Kuwait, from private individuals and from governments. Groups like Ahrar al-Sham is the most famous, the best known inside of Syria, but kind of around the region and inside of Syria, there's a line there. People draw it in different places. Pretty much nobody supports ISIS. There's a few states, and you could make an argument. People would make arguments for Turkey and Qatar supporting al-Nusra. There's a lot of contestation around that, but people would make that argument. And most others would not. Ahrar al-Sham has generally been seen on the other side of that line, and while the United States refuses to arm it, most of our allies do. And then you go down, you can keep going down that list. In general, the more desperate the situation gets, the more the US and everyone else has been moving along that spectrum because they can't find anyone else to arm. And the problem with the Syrian opposition is that al-Nusra, they're good fighters, and they are interwoven deeply with Free Syrian Army and other moderate opposition groups in such a way that it's really difficult for the US to bomb al-Nusra, because when they do, they're also bombing, vetted Syrian rebels, because they're deeply interwoven operationally and on the ground. And this is, to me, a big part of the tragedy of the Syrian insurgency and uprising. Okay, so I think I got both of the questions. Mm-hmm.
Sir, with the weakening of states and means increasing jihadist ideology and government stability, you see lines of territory shifting in your regime statement. If so, what would the nature be?
That's a really good question. I've been thinking about this. A lot of people have been thinking about this in terms of, will the borders change? The Sykes-Picot borders, will they end? I tend to think that they're not going to. I actually think that it's likely that 20 years from now, there's still going to be something called Syria in the current borders of Syria, something called Jordan, something called Lebanon, something called Iraq. I think internally they're going to look a lot different. I think they'll be more decentralized. I mean, I see Syria probably heading towards a de facto but not de jure partition into zones of control without actually changing into new states. The only one where I see it as more likely than not that you'll see an actual de jure change, like an actual legal change, is with the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. And for a long time, I believed that would not happen, simply because the external international environment was so hostile to an independent Kurdistan. At this point, I wonder if it's gone too far in the direction of independence to be reversed. But I don't, again, there's no guarantees, right? I mean, basically, no central government has any operational control over most of Iraq and Syria at this point. And so that's what ISIS did, basically. They simply declared by force that these are the new borders. But you'll notice that nobody in the world recognized those borders, and there's been a steady fight to restore the original borders. Even today, I was in I was in a meeting with the Iraqi Minister of Defense not too long ago, and people were asking him, when you drive ISIS out of Mosul, when they all start running towards the Syrian border, are you going to pursue them? And you might as well have asked him if he was like going to drink a really bad drink. Because he refused to answer the question, because the official policy remains that Iraq and Syria are two different countries and they're two different wars, and they're not, that people want to maintain that border, even if it no longer exists in reality. So you see what I mean? I think that de facto, yes, there's clearly decentralization and erasing of borders as actually mattering, but legally, not so much. It's really a very interesting situation how long that can be sustained.
We have time for one more.
Oh, is that all? Oh, I'm sorry for these long-winded answers, sorry. Why don't I take a couple of questions, fast questions, and I'll try and answer them all together.
My quick question, sir, regarding the Iraqi Kurdistan being most effective tool against ISIS.
Yeah.
Do you see an optimism there?
Okay.
Perhaps as a mentioning the state.
Yeah, I got it. Did you have a question too?
Yes, I was going to ask.
I'm going to try and get as many as I can.
So, in recent months, there's been much more direct intervention from Turkey and Syria. Do you see that as changing how it's the geopolitical situation?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Want to jump in? Okay, I know you all have to get to class. Okay, so on the Iraqi Kurds, and also the Syrian Kurds, by the way, I mean, I think that there's a real idea that the United States could work with them because they kind of seem to be reliable local partners who are outside of all the pathologies of inter-Arab politics. And so one of the things which really complicated working with the Syrian insurgency was that all of these factions, they each had their own local sponsor. So this is a Qatari-backed faction, this is a Saudi-backed faction, this is a Turkish-backed faction. Made it very difficult to work with them. The Kurds were much cleaner to work with and much easier to work with. And so I think that pushed them in that direction. But I would have been more confident that that was going to lead in the direction that, the independent state, that sort of thing, before, actually, because Turkey, this relates to your question, the Turkish intervention in Syria, from where I sit, is more about the Kurds than it is about ISIS or even about Bashar. Turkey was absolutely furious that the United States was going to work with Syrian Kurds, and their intervention has largely been pushing back against Syrian-controlled territory and breaking apart much of what the U.S. had been doing with the Syrian Kurds on the ground there. It's linked to their own domestic conflicts and the like. So I think the Kurds were much more optimistic before Turkey got involved in Syria. Now that Turkey's in Syria, of course it changes things at the tactical level. There's another player in town, large military, and of course that's going to change things in the short run, but I don't think it changes the overall strategic picture other than making it that much more complicated and having one more actor sitting at the table.
Let's thank Dr. Lynch for his time this afternoon.